Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we cover the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion, and joining me on the panel today is Chief Jeff Buchanan and Chief Jeff Johnson. Chief Johnson is the retired fire chief from Tualatin Valley and past IAFC president and the current CEO of the Western Fire Chiefs Association. Chief Johnson has an extensive public safety background with broad experience at the local, national, and international level. He also served as the vice chairman of FirstNet, which is our topic today. And we'll be getting into an exciting announcement they made. But first, Chief Johnson, can you tell us what the inspiration behind FirstNet was?
Well, the inspiration behind FirstNet actually came out of the terrorist strikes in September 11th, 2001. And Congress had commissioned a study that to understand the root causes of how this slipped past us and how our nation needs to be better prepared to deal with terrorist events. It became known as the 9/11 Commission Report. And the 9/11 Commission Report called out the need for a public safety network that would solve the interoperability problems that were experienced on September 11th. So FirstNet actually flowed as the last standing recommendation of the 9/11 Commission Report. And it had still been unsatisfied when we picked up the ball.
Chief Johnson, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. I got to ask, first of all, I love the intro. It doesn't hit on everything. Of course, what people may not know is that you're a serial entrepreneur and all-around badass. And because of that, you were taking point on FirstNet. Can you let the listeners in on why you and three others were nicknamed the Four Horsemen and walk us down some of the story, the trials and tribulations of taking FirstNet from an idea from the report to getting it up and running?
Absolutely. This falls into the classic case, right, where you're a company officer pulling up to a fire and the fire goes good and you get a lot of the credit. There's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on here. It really boils down to the success of a team and frankly, a team ahead of you. If I went all the way back, what we knew, it became obvious to a lot of us in the country that push-to-talk communications were not going to solve everything. And there were 14-year-olds driving by our fire engines on scene that had more communication capability than we did and the engine companies because we didn't have a public safety broadband network. In fact, we were using the same wireless networks on our cell phones that everyone else was using. So we knew that either our industry would not migrate to cellular as a way to move data, or we had to have special features built into a network. And really the first people to see it were led by Harlan McCune. Harlan McCune was a police chief retired out of Ithaca, New York. Harlan led a group that took the first 10 megahertz of spectrum to auction. And like so many things, it wasn't successful as an auction. What it was successful as the precursor to what would be successful. And there were a group of us, the four people you mentioned were Chuck Dowd, he was an assistant chief in New York Police Department, Chris Moore, who was eventually the police chief in the city of San Jose, Dick Mergon, who was the past president of APCO, and myself, who at the time was president of the International Fire Chiefs. And we got together with Harlan and some of his advisors on the board that had taken that spectrum to auction. And we essentially pieced together what went right and what could we do better. And that eventually led to what we now know as FirstNet. And we created an association called the Public Safety Alliance. Every public safety association in the nation was in support of that alliance. And it really took all those people pulling in one direction. And what became dubbed as the Four Horsemen were the four of us. And with the lessons learned from Harlan and the predecessor group, and those guys were all part of helping pull and push that along. And we literally spent the better part of 4 years in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill to convince our senators and representatives that public safety needed special capabilities to move our data across the broadband network. And we had a number of bills that were started and failed for one reason or another. But in the end, at the very end, we had a vehicle known as the Middle Class Tax Relief Act. And regardless of politics, I can just speak the truth. Joe Biden was the vice president for President Obama. The Obama administration had originally opposed our position on building public safety, a broadband network that was unique. And it was Vice President Biden, under the coaching of Terrell McSweeney, who was his local government chief of advisor. It was Vice President Biden at the time that said, this needs to happen for public safety, and we will get this done. And like him or not, he kept his word, and he moved every piece on the chessboard necessary to help us get this done. And in the end, it ended up being bipartisan. The sponsor of the bill that came through for us was Greg Walden, a representative out of Oregon and a key figure in the policy making for these types of matters. And it was Congressman Walden, a Republican, that it was actually his bill that led to this becoming FirstNet.
Chief Johnson, can you tell us what some of the biggest challenges in accomplishing this were?
It's probably odd to say it, but it's just the truth. That what I think I didn't know as a fire chief were the dynamics associated with industry. To me, it was a pretty simple story. Public safety needs to communicate. We have to move data. Every month that goes by, we have more and more need for data. More of our systems, from mapping to building occupancy to criminal records to you name it. It was just demanding a secure network designed by public safety, governed by public safety, built for public safety, not just a commercial network. And we thought that would be pretty compelling as a story on Capitol Hill. And the fact is, it inherently is. But what we missed, because we're public safety people, we missed the fact that there were people in those spaces already. They were selling equipment and technology that wasn't what we imagined. There were existing wireless carriers that did not see this as a viable option for their company to bid on or to make happen. And when that happens, their obligation is to their shareholders. So they tend to look at it and say, is this going to help my company or is this going to hurt my company? And if it's going to help, they tend to support you. And if it's going to hurt their share price or hurt their company, then they tend to use their capabilities and capacity to resist what you're doing and to oppose what you're doing. It's not good or bad. It's just the reality. And I think we underestimated, as public safety, we underestimated what a significant thing that would be. And we really didn't know how Washington, D.C. worked. We quickly learned, and we quickly learned to adjust. So I think that was a surprise to me. And I think the level of resistance was far more sophisticated than the public safety people on our team thought it would be. We thought it was a compelling story. We thought the 9/11 Commission report was a compelling story. We thought helping police, firefighters, and paramedics was a compelling story. But there is a lot of disinformation that happens around you that you have got to battle through. And that means you have got to do your research, and that means you have to dig in and fight for public safety every day. And you have to figure out who your organic supporters are and who are not. And then you have to try to understand why they're not. Some of them just didn't like the idea of a government involved network of any kind. But some of those things are immovable because Spectrum is owned and controlled by the government, licensed by the government, rules set by the government. So they're kind of involved. I think that's probably the number one thing we underestimated. The number two thing was how much time it took. For all of us. And while I mentioned Harlan and I mentioned the four of us, the fact is there were a lot of people involved in this effort. There were a lot of chiefs, Al Gillespie and many others come to mind. There were just a lot of chiefs and a lot of union support for this effort. And it's just like when we needed a room full of uniforms, we got a room full of uniforms. So there's just no way to name everybody. But it was no small effort, and it was strategic beyond strategic. And I will tell you that for those of us involved in that effort, there is a saying we say to each other, this is 100% accurate. If we would have known it was impossible, we wouldn't have tried. Because looking back on it, what was accomplished was in fact impossible. We just didn't know it.
Chief Johnson, I appreciate you bringing up Al Gillespie, who still continues to further the ball as the president of the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association. You have AT&T that wins the bid to build out the network. But as you're telling the story of getting people involved in this and how you and so many others, including the other three of the four horsemen, can you describe for the listeners what steps did you take to get, which to me is just, I almost can't get my arms around the fact that you got 50 states, all 50 states, to buy in and opt in, which had to be done in order to complete this network. Can you describe some of the things and some of the strategies that you used, and perhaps that might be what makes the network even different from other networks? But can you walk the listeners through that process?
Excellent question. So it was a requirement in the law. Like, you can go so far in this process and then it becomes invisible to you. We can say we want this and describe 1 through 10. And then the Republicans and Democrats, when they get to a place where they both figure out that they want this to occur, but they may have differences on what that is, they go into a conference process that's largely invisible to you. And things get added and subtracted that may or may not be meaningful. One of the things that we had not contemplated, but ended up being a great idea, was I believe it was the Republican caucus that wanted each state to approve the plan. And it's essentially this fundamental ideology that the states are preeminent in deciding how they're affected. So there was a requirement that we go to each of the 50 states and the 6 territories and Commonwealth and give them a written plan and seek their concurrence with the plan, negotiate the plan and seek their concurrence with the plan. And third, that the state or Commonwealth or territory would have to agree whether they built the plan or whether they went with the nationwide plan. And we knew that we needed a massive effort to reach out to these states. We knew we needed to start by telling them by what the plan was and how it affected them and how we intended to go about it. And we believe at the end of the day, most states are pretty rational about what their capabilities are. So we started with 8 regional meetings across the country. Our chairwoman, Sue Swenson, who has since been adopted by public safety. Sue Swenson and I and a modest team went to these 8 regional meetings and essentially described the process. And then we had a team of people that went state by state and territory by territory and explained the plan. And in the end, I think the wisdom of having a single nationwide architecture, a single nationwide plan, and a group that would be held accountable to achieve it was more attractive than the states wanting to take that on themselves. And I think essentially being given a choice, that this is the plan, it has to happen. Do you want to do it and be held accountable for its success or failure, or would you rather hold FirstNet accountable for the success or failure? And in all cases, they decided to hold FirstNet accountable to that, and which has now been fully satisfied in all 56 states and territories, Commonwealths. That part is now completed and on time.
It's a pretty tremendous feat for it to be completed and on time. And as you look at all the millions of public safety employees that are using FirstNet now and the tens of thousands of organizations, how are they facing the challenge of bandwidth and all of the video and all the data that needs to get onto FirstNet? Can you bring together for the listeners this notion? I mean, I'm going to toss out a number that I know you know intimately, but can you bring 4.9 into the discussion and where FirstNet needs to go in order to meet the data and the technology that's constantly evolving?
I think we've all been shocked at how popular FirstNet has been with public safety. I think, now, did we have a vision? Did we have plans? Did we have anticipation? Yes, and all that. But the rate at which public safety has flocked to their network has surprised us. I think the numbers are, this is March of 24. I think we are at about around 5.5 million connections and in excess of 25,000 public safety agencies that have joined the network. And that was from a launch 7 years ago. So we had nothing, not a tower in the air, no RAN, nothing 7 years ago. And today with 5.5 million connections, that is a shocking achievement. And I think it's exceeded everyone's wildest estimations. That said, we're also consuming a lot of the network. We have 20 megahertz of 700 spectrum, which is what most of us know as 4G LTE spectrum. And we have plenty of spectrum for a few reasons today. And the reasons are, number one, that when AT&T won the contract, and by the way, this is not AT&T's network, this is public safety's network. AT&T is the contractor that won the bid to build public safety's network. There's a massive distinction. If you're another carrier, you'd like to make it all about AT&T. It's not about AT&T. It's about public safety's network. AT&T won the bid. This bid will come back up again. AT&T may or may not win it again. It's our network, and this is our investment. So we have 20 megahertz. We have a lot of users. We are gaining users at a rapid rate as people figure out that this network is different. It's different because of priority and preemption. It's different because of a disparate and distinct core. It's different in so many ways. But eventually, we anticipate a path to 5G. And while AT&T was wise enough to say, I know you have 20 megahertz public safety, but we will also share all of our spectrum with public safety users so that you have a broader swath. But your spectrum's your spectrum, and we can always retreat back to that. That's helped us get through some of that. But listen, now it's time for 5G, and there will be a 6G and a 7G and whatever follows that right behind it. And that it all requires spectrum. And I think sometimes we talk over people's heads on topics like spectrum. And so I want to describe spectrum for the listeners that aren't dealing with it every day. The federal government in virtually every country leases spectrum. And spectrum is, I want you to imagine a 20-lane freeway. The number's not really 20, but let's just get that in our head. 20 lanes wide and 20 lanes tall. And that 20 by 20 creates 400 lane box that we can all drive on. Those lanes are the equivalent of lanes through the atmosphere, through the sky. And those lanes are what we're authorized to drive on. And that's what spectrum is. Spectrum is invisible lanes in the sky that are digitally and historically analog. Those are lanes through the sky that people can drive on with their data. So it only takes so much till all 400 lanes are filled up. And like I said, the number's not really 400, but you get it. But when those lanes fill up, we need more lanes. And that's what spectrum is. And fortunately, we knew all along that right after 9/11, Congress also gave us additional spectrum. They gave us the 4.9 spectrum. They gave us 50 megahertz of spectrum in 4.9. So think of this. The current network is 20 megahertz in 4G. We have 50 megahertz given to public safety by Congress in 2002. They gave us 50 megahertz. And guess what is perfect for 5G? 4.9 spectrum. So when you hear many of us talking about the use of 4.9 for public safety, and you hear us talking about using 4.9 for 5G, that is our spectrum that we want to use on our network to add 5 and eventually 6G services. We made a promise that we wouldn't go back to Congress for more money. And that's what we said. We said, we're not coming back for more money. And this model has been self-sustaining. And now we want to take our spectrum and apply it to our network to benefit public safety. And so there's other people that would like to take our spectrum and use it for whatever use they have, but not dedicated to public safety's network. And just to be clear, Jeff, there are other networks that serve public safety. There are other carriers that public safety are using, but that is not public safety's network. It is simply a service being sold to public safety. I get it. In many cases, that may be their best choice. Like maybe FirstNet coverage doesn't exist where they are, or whatever their reasons are. But that isn't public safety's network. There's a difference between being the public safety network recognized by federal law and adopted by all 50 states. There's that network with a published plan, with a contractual promise, and with a public safety board, the FirstNet Authority, that oversees the performance of the contractor. There's a difference between that and somebody that just markets public safety. And that's why we say 4.9, that's our spectrum and it belongs on our network.
Steve Johnson, I want to talk a little bit about the reinvestment. On the AT&T website, they have an announcement posted that reads, in February, AT&T announced a 10-year investment to transform Americans' public safety broadband network. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about this investment?
One of the best things about how FirstNet was built is we knew that public safety agencies and individuals would be taking money out of their wallet and mailing it into FirstNet to pay for their monthly service. Well, whether it's lease fees or a portion of those monthly checks, there's a chunk of that money that is essentially held in escrow, as it were, and that money is held for future modernization of the network. And it is that public safety board I talked about, that board that has public safety on it, that governs the contract and holds the contractor responsible. It is that board that takes that annual pot of money that comes in from its users and makes a decision about how that money will be reinvested to continue to ever refresh the network, to modernize it, and to get ready for the next generation of technology. So what they announced recently was a $8 billion reinvestment over 10 years to bring 5G to FirstNet and to add coverage. And fascinating, FirstNet in 7 years already has 250,000 miles more coverage than any other network in America. In 7 years, we have more coverage. Doesn't mean there's coverage everywhere. It doesn't mean that in Fire Department A or Police Department B, they have coverage. Maybe we don't have coverage there yet. But in this 10-year reinvestment plan, it included 5G. It included $2 billion for additional coverage, even though we're already the largest. We're not done and will never be done. It included a promise of 1,000 new public safety sites in the first 2 years. And it had other things in there. The FirstNet Authority, again, the governance board for this, mobile coverage was important to them. That, you show up on a wildfire and there's no towers there and there's no fiber there. You need the ability through satellite and other means to create FirstNet coverage wherever responders go. So the authority had a lot of energy on that as well. So this represents a massive investment. This actually is bigger than the initial investment, which was $7 billion. So it's that reinvestment that is going to continue to mature this network and continue to take its places it hasn't been. It's also worth noting that when we started this initiative, we had spectrum, and we auctioned spectrum to create a pool of money. If I remember the number correctly, that pool of money from our spectrum auction put $39 billion toward deficit reduction and gave the authority, FirstNet Authority, $7 billion to inspire a partner to build this for us. But one of the interesting things about the reinvestment is that over the life of this contract, that $7 billion has to be put back in the wallet of the FirstNet Authority. So when this contract is done with our current contractor, we can either reincent them or incentivize a new partner with cash and a long-term relationship to continue to grow the public safety network and mature it technologically.
Chief Johnson, I only have one more question. I don't know if Samantha has any others, but what comes to mind when you're talking about this very special asset to first responders and public safety is that it needs to be protected, it needs to be preserved, it needs to be strengthened, all these things. And a cliche comes to mind, it takes a village. And that village among you and so many other advocates are fire chiefs and police chiefs and so many others. Is there anything that fire chiefs, police chiefs, others can do to help continue to advocate for this network, to make sure that it's preserved and strengthened? Is there anything fire chiefs, can they get involved?
Great question, Chief. I think it boils down to a few things. I think number one is candid communications. Like if you live in an area where your coverage isn't what you want it to be, or you don't have coverage at all, or there's apps that you would like to see that aren't in our app catalog, or there's capabilities that you don't see, then simply create and fire off an email to the FirstNet Authority. The sitting chairman of the FirstNet Authority is Fire Chief Richard Carrizo out of Missouri. We have a fire chief as the head of one of the largest wireless carriers in America. And Chief Carrizo is a person you can reach. Joe Wassel comes out of the Department of Defense as our CEO at FirstNet. Either of them or anyone on that board would be happy to hear from any public safety chief or responder across this country and say, wow, I wish this network had X, or I wish it had this capability or this app. That information is actually taken in and used. And I think open communication, it starts there. I think second, this is your network. If I'm talking to our public safety partners out there, this is your network. And you have to take a lesson from what all of us that were on Capitol Hill for those 4 years learned, which is other people are going to take swipes at your network and try to make it sound attractive to you. And they're going to try to co-opt you into believing someone else is watching out for you. But the fact is, have them show you their badge and have them talk to you about what they're doing for public safety specifically, and have them tell you how their efforts are strengthening your network. That's the network with a published plan. That's a network with a contractual promise. And that's a network with public safety oversight that governs a contractor we're holding responsible. You have got to fight for our network just like you fight for your budget at home. And right now, at this point in time, fighting to make sure no one gets their hands on your spectrum the 4.9 spectrum, fighting for that and making sure that the FCC is aware that you want that spectrum going to your network. And your network is, by law, FirstNet.
Chief Johnson, is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap up today's conversation?
Well, I'd just like to thank the literally thousands of public safety responders across this country. All the members that sit on the Public Safety Advisory Committee, there's over 50 public safety professionals that do the technical advising for what we have in FirstNet. I'd like to thank the board of directors of FirstNet Authority and all the public safety people that contribute their time there. There are a lot of public safety responders in this country that write letters of support and offer meaningful criticism that makes us better. Think about it as an after action review where, okay, that was good, but how do we get better? All those folks help us tremendously by providing us insight. And I think I'd like to thank AT&T, their leadership. People don't thank them very often, and I know they're a contractor, but they bet their balance sheet. They literally bet their company on public safety. It turned out well for them, by the way. But in spite of that, it didn't mean they didn't take the risk. It could have turned out otherwise. They bet their balance sheet and they bet their company on public safety. And for me, I'm going to support people that take a risk for us. And whether that's a colleague riding an engine with me or whether that's a company that bets their company on us and bets it in a meaningful way through a contract, those are people we need to thank. And lastly, and certainly not insignificantly, is the people on Capitol Hill that stood up for public safety and created this network. And there were so many of them, but on both sides of the aisle, actually. And those people too took a risk and bet on public safety. And I'm glad we were able to prove them right, but none of that matters. What matters is we've got an incredible network. We're 7 years old, which isn't very old. And we need to continue to refine and improve this network and make it better every year. And I think it's worth noting, and this is the fire chief and me speaking, but this network will not be perfect. It will have issues from time to time. It will. All networks will. So will the ones I ran when I was fire chief. So it was the county's network that I sat on the board of. And I don't think there's a chief sitting on a 911 board or PSAP board on listening to my voice today that doesn't know how true that is. There are going to be issues. Question is, do we have an accountable process whereby we learn from those lessons and we make ourselves better? And it is this continuous quality improvement cycle where we're improving the network. When we see a problem, we openly and honestly identify it and we make sure it doesn't happen again. We'll have a new problem next time. But that happens with all technology and all network. It's all about the process of being accountable and open and continuous improvement. And there's a lot of people involved in that. So I also want to thank the two of you for inviting me to be with you today on this podcast. And we'll always happily answer any questions people have.
That's very well said, Chief Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. A link to the article we discussed can be found in the show notes. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media. If you have a question for the panel or one of our guests, please reach out to us at fireheadlines@wfca.com and let us know what's on your mind. We'll see you back here next week for more Fire Headlines.